What are you supposed to give a fuck about, according to you? Is it different for each person, or are there rules people can kind of follow to figure it out?
I intentionally don't answer that question because I don't feel it's right for me to impose my values on any of my readers. I do simply, at times in the book, I offer kind of what I've discovered is better or worse to give a fuck about for myself. And I do provide...
I'm going to harass you about that in a minute or two. So I thought I'd warn you about that. So you can prepare.
Thanks for the warning.
Yeah, no problem.
I do lay out, I think, some principles that I generally, I think, find to be useful. So generally it's more useful to focus on kind of what it's not the most sophisticated terms, but internal values versus external values. So focus on things that occur inside of you, focus on your own integrity, focus on your own honesty. These are things that you experience internally versus, say, things that you experience externally, external markers of validation.
What would that be? Like fame? Is that an example you
money?
used?
Yeah. So money, social media followers, things like that, having a nice car. There's nothing wrong with those, but it's similar to the discussion we were having earlier. Like we all like money. We all like having nice things, but there needs to be, you can't only value those things. Like you have to have a balance of kind of more internally driven things that you care about.
So I do think that you impose your values on your readers. But I actually think, I'm going to make two observations. The first is that I think that apologizing for that is the most predictable thing that a millennial could possibly do. Because I think your generation, and perhaps even more the generation younger than you, what they've been taught above all else is that the cardinal moral sin is to judge, to be judgmental, right? To be discriminating. Mm-hmm. But that's absolutely foolish. And you actually make a case for that because you say that one of the most important things that you can do, and by you mean you, but you also mean other people, is to say no. And that as soon as you value one thing, which you need to do, and hopefully the proper thing, you're saying no to a very large number of other things. And so this is why the stance of the idea that you can raise being non-judgmental to the level of a higher moral virtue is definitely wrong. If your claim is correct, that your emotional state depends on your value structure, and it's more important than anything else to get your value structure straight, and if you have a value structure, you have to say yes to some things and no to others, then you immediately admit that there's a value hierarchy and there's some things at the top and some things at the bottom. And I think one of the real strengths of your book is that you at least begin to do that. And I think you do it explicitly. So you say quite straightforwardly that there are 5 things that you've discovered that are of general utility, that you've found of general utility. And you don't say that you're certain that you're 100% right about those 5 things. But you certainly make the claim that the reader should take them seriously and that they've been useful to you. And that was taking responsibility. And you do a very careful job of distinguishing that from accepting universal fault, which is a good piece of intellectual exercise because it's necessary to take responsibility and to discriminate that from assuming universal fault. You can get cancer, and it's not necessarily your fault. In fact, it probably isn't. But you still have to take responsibility for it, or suffer the consequences. You talk about the necessity to accept and cultivate the ability to tolerate, to accept uncertainty and to cultivate the ability to tolerate it. You talk about learning to appreciate failure. You talk about rejection, we already mentioned that, and the ability to say no, and the necessity of saying no, and perhaps the unapologetic necessity of saying no. And you also, you make that concrete in some sense because you talk about, for example, that you learned as you transitioned from your 20s to your 30s that saying no to an entire smorgasbord, let's say, of sexual possibilities was worthwhile because you found something deeper in the commitment to a single person. And that's a form of sacrifice. You talk about sacrifice in your second book. And, you made a sacrifice, and sacrifices are actually worthwhile. And then you talk about contemplation of your own mortality as a way of discriminating between what's important and what isn't. And then in your second book, you talk about both Nietzsche and Kant in some detail, and both of them were striving for the apprehension of something approximating a universal morality. And so I can see that. Yep. And you also mention Ernest Becker, Becker believed that.
All right, you got me.
Well, what do you say to that?
Yeah. You got me. Well, you totally, no, you are right. It's funny because, so now I'm kind of doing like a check of my, because you are right. You are correct. I think, and I'm going to admit here, I gave you guys the stock answer there,
that's a dangerous thing to do.
I know, well, especially with you guys, but I've been asked a million times, people are like, oh, so what should we give a fuck about? And my de facto answer has always been like, well, it's not my place to tell people exactly what their values should
be. That's definitely bullshit. That's definitely
Yeah.
not true. That's exactly what you're trying to do. Now,
and 13 million people are listening.
I think the reason you get away with it is because you're trying to do it for yourself too. You're not preaching.
And you're kind of inferring, right? You say, this is what worked for me, but it could work for you.
Right.
Yeah. And let me present some context to this, which I think can be helpful. My background is straight up just the self-help world. And generally in the self-help world, values are just shoved down your throat. You're supposed to want the fancy car. You're supposed to want the perfect marriage. You're supposed to want to be happy and live happily ever after. It's like, these are the things that are taken for granted at page one. And so, when I wrote Subtle Art, I went through pains to kind of be contrarian in a lot of ways to what a typical self-help book is. And so one of those ways was, I don't want to explicitly ram values down people's throats, but I agree with you that the overarching project of the book is, yes, I am imposing, even if I don't come out and say it, like, this is what you should give a fuck about. It's the way I've constructed the book, and particularly the second book. The second book is much more striving for some sort of solid structure to believe in.
That's this book, by the way.
Yeah.
Just so everybody knows. Well, you hooked yourself into this project as soon as you made that initial discovery. Like, you made quite a profound discovery in my estimation, which was that values regulate emotion.
Yeah.
So then as soon as you make that discovery, you're stuck with a question, which is, okay, then what are the appropriate values
that make me happy?
Well, or even, well, if it's not happy, it's some other metric, because you could also question whether or not happy is the right ultimate value.
I like happiness. I know you're like, it's not about being happy, but.
Well, it beats the hell out of being miserable.
Yes,
if happiness comes along, you should be bloody happy that it's like lit on your stem for a while.
Yeah.
Yeah. But it's, and then as soon as you get into that question, it's turtles all the way down, right? Like, that takes you into, kind of staring into the void, so to speak, which you talk about in your work quite a bit of how there's, you have to take on the responsibility to create something that's meaningful in your life.
Yes, or to discover it. That's one of the weaknesses of Nietzsche, I think. I mean, I'm a great admirer of Nietzsche, and I've never read anyone who could think with as much glittering brilliance as Nietzsche, and he's very dangerous to read because he's so unbelievably intelligent. He'll take everything you know apart, sometimes with a sentence. He said once, he was bragging in a sort of self-deprecatory manner in some sense. I mean, he never sold any books, and so he was sort of bragging to himself, I suppose. He said, I can say in a sentence what it takes other people in an entire book to say, what they can't say in an entire book. And that actually happens to be true. Nietzsche could, in fact, do that. And he believed that we could create our own values, but that's wrong. We can't create our own values. We can discover them and we can co-create them. But, you know, and you know this in your book as well. It comes out again implicitly. You wouldn't be able to violate your conscience if you could create your own values. Right?
Violate your conscience?
Yeah, because your conscience, you'll
lower this for me a little bit.
You'll do something that your conscience objects to.
Okay.
Okay. And if you were fully capable of creating your own values, your conscience would never object. You would just go along with what you'd proposed. Like if we were the sorts of creatures that could do that. But what we find very rapidly is we try very hard to impose our own values. And then it fails. We're not satisfied by what we're pursuing, or we become extremely guilty, or we become ashamed, or we're hurt, or we hurt other people. And sometimes that doesn't mean we're wrong, but most often it does. And so your search for bedrock, I think, is, and perhaps the fact that you never do come to any final conclusion, is definitely, at least in my opinion, so maybe not definitely, but in my opinion, a large part of the reason why your books are attractive. You know, the millennials, you talk about the consumer literature that shows that people who have an infinite variety of choices are less happy than people who only have one or two. And you mentioned at the beginning of this discussion that the millennial generation that you're a part of suffered in some sense because they weren't deprived enough and had too many choices. The advantage to being deprived is that it's obvious what to do. Like if you're starving, then you eat. Yeah. There's no question. But if you have enough to eat and you have enough shelter and you have enough information, maybe not as much as you could have, but enough, it starts to become difficult to decide what to do. And then you have another problem, which is that you can't decide what to do. Yeah. And then you have to start to investigate value. And that seems to me, even from your autobiographical comments, seemed to be what happened with you and obviously so many other people.
Absolutely.